At my sister's wedding, they handed me a name tag that said "the poor relative." Everyone laughed. I smiled too. 3 hours later, nobody in that ballroom was laughing anymore. I'm Evelyn Harper, and at 68 years old, I thought I had learned not to let other people's opinions wound me. Life has a way of teaching that lesson over and over again. Still, some moments find the cracks you didn't know were still there. The wedding took place on a warm Saturday afternoon in Charleston, South Carolina. The ceremony was being held at an elegant waterfront venue decorated with white roses, crystal chandeliers, and enough gold accents to make every photograph look expensive. My older sister Judith had always loved attention. Even as children, she could walk into a room and somehow make everyone focus on her. This wedding, her third, was no exception. I arrived 20 minutes early wearing a navy blue dress I had owned for several years. It was simple, comfortable, and appropriate for the occasion. While other guests stepped out of luxury SUVs and posed for photos near the entrance, I quietly parked my 12-year-old Subaru near the back of the lot and walked toward the reception hall. The young woman working the registration table smiled politely when I gave her my name. She searched through a stack of cards and handed one to me. "Welcome, Miss Harper," she said. "We're so glad you could make it." I thanked her and glanced down at the card. At first, I thought I had misread it. Then I looked again. Printed in elegant gold lettering were 4 words: "The poor relative." I stood completely still. Around me, guests continued chatting and laughing. Somewhere in the distance, a violin quartet played softly. The young woman behind the table noticed my expression. "Is everything okay?" she asked. I forced a smile. "I'm sure it's fine." My voice sounded calm, surprisingly calm. The kind of calm that only comes when disappointment is older than the moment causing it. I pinned the name tag onto my dress and walked inside. The ballroom was beautiful. Sunlight reflected across the water outside the enormous windows. Servers moved gracefully between tables carrying trays of sparkling drinks. At the center of it all stood Judith, glowing beneath the attention she had spent her entire life chasing. She spotted me almost immediately. "Evelyn," she called. "You made it." She hugged me lightly, then stepped back and looked directly at my name tag. A smile flickered across her face. Not surprise. Recognition. She knew. "Very funny," I said quietly. Judith laughed. "Oh, come on. It's just a joke. Everyone knows you never cared much about money." Before I could answer, another relative approached. Then another. Several glanced at my tag and smirked. One man chuckled openly. A woman I barely recognized whispered something to her husband, and both of them laughed behind their champagne glasses. I nodded politely and continued moving through the room. Years ago, I might have defended myself. I might have demanded an apology, but age teaches different forms of strength. Sometimes silence reveals more than arguments ever could. As the afternoon continued, I noticed something unsettling. The joke wasn't spontaneous. It had been planned. Multiple guests referenced it. Several used the exact same phrase, "the poor relative." Every time they said it, they looked at me with a mixture of amusement and pity, as though they had already decided who I was. As though a person's worth could be measured by the car they drove or the clothes they wore. I found my assigned seat and sat quietly. The name card resting on the table carried the same label, "the poor relative." This time there was no doubt. Someone had gone out of their way to make sure everyone saw it. I folded the card carefully and slipped it into my purse. Then I looked across the room toward Judith. She was laughing with a group of guests, raising a glass in celebration. For a moment, our eyes met. She smiled confidently. She thought she knew exactly who I was. The truth was that Judith Harper had spent years believing she understood her younger sister. And before this wedding day was over, she was about to discover how wrong she had been. I sat there for several minutes pretending to study the wedding program while my mind drifted somewhere far beyond the ballroom. The laughter around me faded into background noise. What stayed with me was not the name tag itself. It was how familiar the feeling was. Judith had always been skilled at turning small insults into family traditions. The older we became, the more polished she got at it. Growing up in Ohio, we had shared a bedroom, shared clothes, and shared dreams about the future. Back then, neither of us had much. Our father worked long hours, and our mother stretched every dollar until it felt like a miracle. Yet somewhere along the way, Judith began measuring success differently. She chased appearances, bigger houses, newer cars, more expensive vacations. The strange thing was that she usually assumed everyone else was playing the same game, especially me. A server stopped beside my table and offered a tray of sparkling water. I thanked him and took a glass. Across the room, Judith was showing guests photographs from a recent Mediterranean cruise. A small crowd gathered around her, admiring the images. I watched for a moment and then looked away. I had nothing against success. I had nothing against wealth. What troubled me was how often people confused wealth with value. Over the years, family gatherings had slowly changed. Invitations became selective. Conversations became performative. Every holiday felt less like a reunion and more like a competition. Judith usually won because she wanted the prize more than anyone else. About 5 years earlier, during Thanksgiving, she had spent 20 minutes describing her kitchen renovation. Marble imported from Italy, custom cabinets, designer lighting. Then she had looked directly at me and asked if I was still living in my little cottage. Not because she cared, because she wanted the room to hear the comparison. I remembered smiling then, just as I smiled now. Another memory surfaced. A birthday dinner for one of our cousins. Judith introducing me to someone by saying, "Evelyn prefers a simpler lifestyle." The words sounded harmless until she added, "Some people are comfortable settling." Everyone laughed politely. I laughed too. What else was there to do? The truth was that my life had never felt small to me. My cottage overlooked a lake. My mornings began with coffee on the porch and birdsong drifting through the trees. I volunteered at the local library twice a week. I had friends who showed up when they said they would. I slept peacefully at night. Those things never impressed people at cocktail parties, but they mattered. They mattered a great deal. A burst of applause pulled me back to the present. Guests were finding their seats for the reception. As people settled around me, I noticed several glancing at my place card before looking at me. Some smiled awkwardly. Others seemed amused. One woman leaned toward another and whispered something that caused both of them to suppress a laugh. I focused on my glass and let the moment pass. Embarrassment only works when you agree to carry it. Still, I could not shake the realization that this had required planning. Someone had ordered the cards. Someone had approved them. Someone had decided that turning me into a joke would make the celebration more entertaining. My gaze drifted toward Judith again. She was radiant beneath the chandelier light, greeting guests as though she owned the entire evening. Perhaps she believed she did. Yet for the first time that afternoon, I noticed something else. Not confidence. Expectation. She kept looking in my direction as though waiting for a reaction, waiting for anger, waiting for tears, waiting for me to prove whatever story she had been telling about me all these years. I lowered my eyes and adjusted the folded place card resting inside my purse. Then I smiled quietly to myself. Judith thought she understood everything about her younger sister. She thought the story had already been written. She had no idea that the most important chapter had never been shared with anyone in that room. The reception moved forward with the polished rhythm that expensive events always seem to have. Music floated through the ballroom. Crystal glasses caught the late afternoon sunlight. Guests exchanged stories and compliments while servers carried plates from table to table with practiced precision. From a distance, everything looked perfect. Up close, I could see the cracks. I had spent enough years around family gatherings to recognize them. They lived in certain smiles, certain pauses, certain glances exchanged when people thought nobody was paying attention. The woman seated beside me introduced herself as one of Judith's friends from her country club. She was pleasant enough at first. Then she looked at my place card and tilted her head. "I suppose your sister has quite the sense of humor," she said. I smiled politely. "She always has." The woman laughed softly. "Well, families do love their little jokes." Little jokes. That phrase stayed with me. People often use it when they want to excuse cruelty. They wrap it in humor and call it harmless. Yet the target always understands the difference. I took a sip of water and looked around the room. Judith was moving from table to table like a politician working a crowd. Every few minutes, she would stop for photographs. Every few minutes, someone would laugh. She seemed energized by attention in a way I never understood. Across the ballroom, I noticed my niece Claire speaking with several guests near the dance floor. She was elegant, confident, and perfectly dressed for the occasion. For a brief moment, our eyes met. Instead of smiling, she quickly looked away. That surprised me. Claire had always been kinder than her mother. Not perfect, but kinder. The avoidance felt deliberate, as though she knew something she wished she did not. I filed the observation away. Years had taught me that people reveal more through discomfort than through confidence. Dinner was served shortly afterward. The conversation at my table drifted toward careers, investments, second homes, and travel plans. One guest described a ski trip in Colorado. Another discussed property values in Florida. Eventually, someone asked about me. "And what do you do these days, Evelyn?" A man across the table asked. Before I could answer, another guest smiled and said, "She enjoys a simpler life." The exact phrase Judith had used for years. Several people nodded knowingly. It was remarkable how quickly a label could spread once someone attached it to you. I answered honestly. I told them about my volunteer work at the library. I told them about the literacy program I helped support. I mentioned the lake near my home and the community events I enjoyed attending. The conversation lasted less than a minute before drifting back toward money and status. Apparently, my life was not interesting enough to compete with luxury real estate and private golf memberships. I did not mind. What interested me was how eager everyone seemed to rank one another, as though life were a ladder and every conversation was another chance to compare positions. While dessert was being served, I excused myself and stepped onto an outdoor terrace overlooking the water. The evening air felt cooler there, gentler. For the first time all day, I could hear my own thoughts. Boats moved slowly across the harbor. The setting sun painted streaks of orange and gold across the surface. I rested my hands on the railing and breathed deeply. Then I heard footsteps behind me. "Beautiful view, is it not?" a familiar voice said. I turned and saw Thomas Reed standing a few feet away. His silver hair was neatly combed. His dark suit looked as immaculate as ever. We had known each other for more than 20 years. He offered a small smile. Not a curious smile, not a sympathetic one, a knowing smile. His eyes moved briefly toward the ballroom before returning to me. "You have been very patient today, Evelyn," he said quietly. I looked at him for a moment. Then I reached into my purse and touched the folded place card resting inside. "Patience becomes easier," I replied, "when you know something other people do not." Thomas nodded slowly. Neither of us said another word. We did not need to. When Thomas returned to the ballroom, I remained on the terrace for another minute, watching the last traces of sunlight disappear beyond the harbor. The evening had reached that point where celebrations often become louder, looser, and less careful. People who had spent hours presenting polished versions of themselves began revealing more than they intended. By the time I walked back inside, the reception had shifted into its next phase. Conversations were louder. Laughter carried farther. The band was preparing for another set. Judith stood near the center of the room, surrounded by guests. She looked completely at ease. If she had noticed my conversation with Thomas, she showed no sign of it. I returned to my seat just as coffee was being served. Across the table, two guests were discussing family inheritances. One man joked that every family gathering eventually turned into a discussion about money. Several people laughed. Judith overheard the comment and raised her glass. "That is because money reveals character," she declared. The statement drew approving nods from several nearby guests. I quietly stirred cream into my coffee. Money reveals character. It was an interesting idea. In my experience, money did not create character. It exposed what was already there. Generosity became more generous. Kindness became kinder. Insecurity became louder. Pride became impossible to hide. The evening continued. More speeches followed. Friends shared stories. Family members offered congratulations. Then Claire stepped to the microphone. Her speech was warm and sincere. Unlike many others that evening, it sounded genuine. She spoke about loyalty, resilience, and the importance of family bonds. Yet several times her eyes drifted toward me. Each time, she seemed uneasy. The feeling returned that she knew something. Or perhaps she knew what had been done and regretted remaining silent. When her speech ended, applause filled the ballroom. Judith embraced her daughter proudly. Then came another round of drinks. Another round of laughter. Another opportunity for attention. Eventually, Judith moved toward the microphone herself. The room settled almost instantly. She loved moments like this. Loved holding an audience. Loved knowing every eye was focused on her. She thanked the guests for attending. She praised the venue, the staff, and the family members who had helped organize the celebration. People smiled and listened attentively. Then her tone shifted, subtly at first. "One thing I have always appreciated," she said, "is that success requires effort. It requires ambition. It requires refusing to settle." Several guests nodded. I felt Thomas glance in my direction from across the room. Judith continued speaking. Some people spend their lives building something meaningful. Others simply drift along and hope things work out. A few people chuckled. The meaning was becoming clear. She did not need to mention a name. Everyone understood exactly where she was aiming. Judith paused dramatically before smiling. Fortunately, every family serves a purpose. Some teach us what to become. Others teach us what not to become. More laughter followed. Not everyone joined in. I noticed Claire looking down at her hands. I noticed several guests exchanging uncomfortable glances. Even they could feel the edge beneath the humor. I sat quietly and listened. No anger, no embarrassment, only clarity. For years I had wondered whether Judith understood the effect of her words. Tonight answered that question. She understood perfectly. The comments were not accidents. They were choices, deliberate ones. I reached into my purse and felt the folded place card again. The paper had become slightly creased from being handled throughout the evening. A small reminder, a small piece of evidence. Across the room, Judith smiled confidently as applause followed her remarks. She believed the room belonged to her. She believed the story belonged to her. And she believed that everyone already knew who Evelyn Harper was. Soon, she would discover how little she actually knew. The applause faded, conversations resumed, and the reception moved forward as though nothing unusual had happened. Yet something had changed for me. Judith's speech had removed the last trace of uncertainty. For years I had given her the benefit of the doubt. I had blamed stress, insecurity, and even misunderstanding. That evening, sitting beneath crystal chandeliers while strangers laughed at carefully prepared jokes, I finally accepted a simple truth. Some people do not diminish others by accident. They do it by choice. I looked around the ballroom and wondered how many people truly knew my sister. They knew the polished version, the charming version, the woman who hosted fundraisers, joined committees, and never missed an opportunity to be photographed at community events. Very few had seen the Judith I grew up with. The Judith who could turn a compliment into a competition. The Judith who remembered every slight, but forgot every kindness. The Judith who always needed to stand one step higher than everyone else. My thoughts drifted back more than 20 years. Back to a quiet afternoon in Vermont shortly after our father passed away. The memory remained vivid despite the passing years. I could still remember the scent of pine trees outside the office window and the weight of grief that seemed to settle over everything during that season of life. Our father had never been a flashy man. He drove practical vehicles, wore ordinary clothes, and rarely discussed money. If someone had asked which of his daughters would inherit a fortune, nobody would have guessed either of us. Yet appearances had always been his favorite lesson. He often said that the world rewarded people for looking successful while quietly ignoring those who actually were. On that afternoon, Thomas Reed had invited me to a private meeting. I expected routine paperwork. Instead, I learned something that altered the course of my life. There had been investments, long-term holdings, land acquired decades earlier, careful planning hidden beneath a lifetime of modest living. Most importantly, there had been instructions, very specific instructions. Thomas explained that my father had established a trust designed to grow over time. He believed wealth carried responsibilities as well as privileges. He wanted the assets protected from family politics, emotional decisions, and public attention. I remember staring at the documents in silence. The numbers hardly seemed real. Neither did my father's final message. Thomas handed me a letter written in my father's unmistakable handwriting. I could still recall one particular line almost word for word. He wrote, "The strongest people are not the ones who display what they have. They are the ones who know they do not need to." At the time, I did not fully understand what he meant. Years later, I did. That trust allowed me to live comfortably without ever needing to prove anything. It allowed me to support causes I believed in. It allowed me to help people quietly. Most importantly, it allowed me to walk away from the endless competition that consumed so many lives. Back in the ballroom, I watched Judith greeting guests near the dance floor. She had spent years measuring success through visible symbols. Bigger homes, more expensive vacations, more impressive stories. She never realized that the one person she constantly underestimated had never been playing the same game. Across the room, Thomas caught my eye briefly. His expression remained calm, steady, patient, the same expression he had worn for 2 decades whenever the subject remained unspoken. I nodded slightly. He understood. The secret had survived many years. Tonight, for the first time, I began to wonder whether it was finally time for that silence to end. The band began playing again, but fewer people were paying attention now. The evening had settled into that comfortable stage where guests believed they understood everything around them. Conversations became more confident. Assumptions became stronger. Stories became exaggerated. I sat quietly and watched it all unfold. There was something strangely revealing about a celebration that lasted long enough. Eventually, people stopped performing and started exposing themselves. A few tables away, I overheard someone describing Judith as the most successful person in the family. Another guest immediately agreed. They listed her accomplishments like items on a resume: properties, investments, social connections, exclusive memberships. Nobody mentioned kindness. Nobody mentioned loyalty. Nobody mentioned character. The omission did not seem to bother anyone. Claire appeared beside my table carrying a glass of sparkling water. For a moment she hesitated before sitting in the empty chair next to me. "Are you enjoying yourself?" she asked. The question sounded polite, but there was concern underneath it. "I have certainly learned a few things tonight," I replied. Claire lowered her eyes. "I am sorry about some of the jokes." There it was. Not denial. Not confusion. Confirmation. She knew. "You do not need to apologize for other people," I said gently. She looked relieved and guilty at the same time. "I tried to talk Mom out of some of it," she admitted quietly. "She thought everyone would find it funny." I nodded. The answer did not surprise me. Judith had always mistaken attention for approval. If people laughed, she assumed she was right. Claire glanced toward the dance floor where her mother was entertaining another circle of admirers. "Sometimes she gets carried away," she said. "Sometimes," I agreed. Claire wanted to say more. I could see it. But before she could continue, someone called her name from across the room. She stood and squeezed my shoulder gently before leaving. As she walked away, I felt a flicker of sympathy. She was trapped between affection and honesty. That was not an easy place to stand. The evening moved closer to its final major event. The formal toasts. Guests gradually returned to their seats. Glasses were refilled. Conversations softened. Anticipation settled over the ballroom. Judith loved speeches. She loved microphones even more. The master of ceremonies stepped forward and welcomed everyone's attention. One by one, speakers approached the podium. Friends shared stories. Family members offered congratulations. The audience laughed at familiar memories and applauded at appropriate moments. Everything followed the expected script. Then Judith's new husband delivered his remarks and received a standing ovation. The room glowed with approval. Judith looked delighted. For most people, that would have been enough. For Judith, it never was. When she returned to the microphone for what was supposed to be a brief closing toast, I immediately sensed trouble. Her smile had changed. It carried that familiar edge I had known since childhood. She thanked everyone again and spoke about family support. Then she began talking about success, about ambition, about people who create opportunities rather than wait for them. Several guests nodded enthusiastically. The comments grew sharper with each sentence. More personal, more deliberate. Finally, she raised her champagne glass and smiled directly toward my table. "Family is not measured by money," she said. The room became quiet. Then she added, "Although it certainly helps when some members actually have it." Laughter erupted from several corners of the ballroom. Not everyone laughed, but enough did. Judith smiled, triumphantly, as though she had delivered the perfect punchline. For a brief moment, every eye in the room turned toward me, and in that silence, I realized something important. Judith believed she had reached the highest point of the evening. She had no idea she had just stepped onto the edge of a cliff. The laughter lingered for a few seconds longer than it should have. That was the part one noticed most. Not Judith's remark, not the guests who looked uncomfortable. It was the people who laughed because they believed the joke was safe. They believed they understood the situation. They believed they knew exactly where everyone stood. I remained seated until the room grew quiet again. Then I rose from my chair. The movement was simple, but it drew attention immediately. A few conversations stopped. Several guests turned in my direction. Judith watched me with a confident smile, clearly expecting some emotional response. Perhaps she expected me to leave. Perhaps she expected tears. Perhaps she expected the kind of reaction that would allow her to dismiss me as overly sensitive. Instead, I picked up my purse and walked calmly across the ballroom. The sound of my shoes against the polished floor seemed unusually loud in the silence. When I reached the front of the room, I did not ask for the microphone. I did not challenge Judith. I did not defend myself. Instead, I turned toward Thomas Reed. He was seated near the front beside several longtime family friends. Our eyes met. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then I reached into my purse and removed a large sealed envelope that had traveled with me for years. Not because I planned to use it, because I believed in being prepared if the day ever arrived. Quietly, I handed the envelope to Thomas. A ripple of confusion spread through the room. Judith frowned. "Evelyn, what exactly are you doing?" she asked. I smiled politely. "Nothing dramatic, Judith." Thomas carefully opened the envelope. The room grew even quieter. Guests shifted in their seats. Some leaned forward. Others exchanged puzzled glances. Thomas removed several documents and adjusted his glasses. His expression never changed. That alone captured my attention. After more than 20 years, he already knew what was inside. Yet he understood the significance of this moment. Judith laughed nervously. "This feels very mysterious." A few guests joined her laughter, though it sounded less certain now. Thomas looked toward me. I nodded once. That was all the permission he needed. He stepped forward and accepted the microphone from the master of ceremonies. The ballroom fell completely silent. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice steady and professional. "My name is Thomas Reed. I have served as legal counsel for the Harper family for many years." Several guests straightened in their chairs. Judith's smile faded slightly. Thomas continued, "The documents before me concern a family trust established decades ago by the late William Harper." At the mention of our father's name, the room became even more attentive. I watched Judith carefully. Confusion had replaced confidence. Thomas turned a page. "The trust has been professionally managed and allowed to grow according to the instructions of its creator." Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The room seemed suspended in anticipation. Then Thomas read the figure aloud. "As of this year, the current value of the Harper Family Trust exceeds $12 million. For one extraordinary moment, there was no sound at all. No laughter, no music, no whispered conversations. Nothing. It was as though the entire ballroom had forgotten how to breathe." Judith stared at Thomas, then at me, then back at the documents. Around the room, expressions changed with astonishing speed. Amusement vanished. Confidence vanished. Assumptions vanished. The same people who had spent the evening judging me suddenly looked uncertain. Several guests blinked as though they had misheard. Others simply stared. I remained exactly where I was, calm and silent. Because the number itself was never the point. The real revelation was something much larger. Every person in that ballroom had spent the evening measuring my worth. And every one of them had been measuring with the wrong scale. The silence lasted longer than anyone expected. It was remarkable how quickly confidence could disappear when assumptions collided with reality. Moments earlier, guests had been smiling, laughing, and judging. Now they sat frozen in their seats, staring at Thomas, the documents, and then at me. Judith was the first to speak. "That cannot be right," she said. Her voice sounded smaller than before. Not angry. Not yet. Just stunned. Thomas looked at her calmly. "The records are accurate." He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. Facts rarely require volume. Judith forced a nervous laugh. There must be some misunderstanding. Thomas simply handed her one of the documents. She scanned the page. The color slowly drained from her face. Around the room, whispers began spreading from table to table. I could hear fragments of conversations. Questions. Speculation. Surprise. Some guests looked embarrassed. Others looked fascinated. A few suddenly seemed eager to make eye contact with me, as though friendliness could erase an entire evening of disrespect. I remained exactly where I was. For years, people had mistaken silence for weakness. What they never understood was that silence can also be patience. Claire slowly rose from her chair and walked toward me. Unlike everyone else, she was not staring at the numbers. She was looking at me. "You knew this whole time," she said softly. "Yes. And you never told anyone?" I smiled. There was never a reason to. Claire looked down for a moment before nodding. There was no accusation in her expression, only understanding. Perhaps for the first time that evening, someone truly understood the lesson. Across the ballroom, guests continued reacting. A man who had joked about my lifestyle suddenly seemed very interested in complimenting my composure. Another guest who had barely acknowledged me all night now offered a warm smile. The change was almost immediate. That was what saddened me most. Not because people had underestimated me, because their opinion changed the moment they heard a number. The same person stood before them, the same life, the same values, the same character, yet suddenly they saw me differently. Thomas stepped aside and allowed the room to absorb the revelation. Nobody laughed anymore. Nobody seemed interested in jokes. Judith finally looked up from the papers. Her expression was impossible to miss. Years of certainty had cracked in a matter of seconds. "Why would you hide something like this?" she asked. The question echoed through the ballroom. I considered it carefully before answering. Because it was never my most important quality. The room remained silent. I never wanted my life to be measured by money. I continued. I wanted it measured by how I treated people. Several guests lowered their eyes. Others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The words were not cruel. They did not need to be. Truth has a way of finding its target without assistance. I looked around the ballroom one final time. The luxury decorations were still beautiful. The expensive venue was still impressive. Nothing about the room had changed. Yet everything felt different. The evening had begun with people assigning value based on appearances. Now those appearances meant very little. For the first time all night, Judith seemed unsure of what to say next. And for the first time in many years, I realized that the conversation was no longer happening on her terms. The room remained quiet long after my words faded. Nobody seemed quite sure how to move forward. The evening had taken a direction nobody expected. Yet as I looked around the ballroom, I realized something important. The surprise was not that I had access to wealth. The surprise was that the assumptions people made about me had been wrong. That was the part they were struggling to accept. Judith stood motionless for several seconds, still holding the documents Thomas had given her. The confidence that had carried her through the evening seemed distant now. For the first time, she looked uncertain, human, vulnerable in a way I had rarely seen. Finally, she spoke. "Evelyn, why did you never tell the family?" I looked at my sister and thought about all the years behind us. Childhood birthdays, holiday dinners, shared memories, small disappointments, unspoken rivalries. Because I wanted to know who valued me before they knew what I had. I answered. Nobody interrupted. Nobody laughed. The words settled over the room like a truth people recognized. Immediately, Judith lowered her eyes. Claire stood nearby, listening carefully. Several guests shifted in their seats. I could see them replaying earlier conversations in their minds. The jokes, the assumptions, the labels, the little moments they had considered harmless. I reached into my purse and removed the folded place card that had accompanied me throughout the evening. Slowly, I unfolded it and looked at the words printed across the front. Then I placed it on the nearest table where everyone could see it. A few guests looked away. Others stared at it in silence. "This card told me everything I needed to know," I said calmly. "Not about myself, about everyone else." Nobody argued, because nobody could. The card had never revealed my value. It had revealed theirs. I turned toward Thomas. "Would you please explain the charitable provisions?" He nodded and opened another document. The room became attentive once again. "According to the current structure of the trust," Thomas began, "a significant portion of future distributions has already been designated for educational scholarships, literacy initiatives, community health programs, and assistance for widows in financial hardship." A murmur spread through the audience. Several guests looked surprised. Others looked impressed. Judith looked confused. "You are giving it away?" she asked. I smiled gently. "Not all of it, but enough." The answer seemed to puzzle many people. They had spent the evening assuming wealth existed for display, for status, for comparison. The idea that money could simply become a tool for helping others appeared unfamiliar to them. Claire was the first person to smile. A genuine smile, the kind that reaches the eyes. "Grandpa would have liked that," she said softly. I felt a lump form in my throat. "Yes," I replied. "I think he would have." The atmosphere in the room began changing again. This time, however, it was not driven by shock. It was driven by reflection. People seemed less interested in the number and more interested in what it represented. The band remained silent. The harbor lights shimmered beyond the windows. For the first time all evening, nobody seemed concerned about appearances. Eventually, I picked up my purse and prepared to leave. There was nothing more to prove. Nothing more to reveal. As I walked toward the exit, guests stepped aside respectfully. Some offered apologies. Some offered smiles. Some simply nodded. Judith remained where she stood. Our eyes met one final time. I did not feel victorious. I did not feel angry. Mostly, I felt free. Outside, the evening air was cool and peaceful. I walked toward my old Subaru parked near the back of the lot. It looked exactly the same as it had when I arrived. So did I? The only thing that had changed was the illusion people carried about me. They spent years believing I was the poor relative. The truth was much simpler. I had never been poor at all. Not in the ways that mattered most.